What's up, y'all? This is Josh with Bloody Beaver Podcast. Way back when I was doing research for episode 13 on the mysterious death of Butch Cassidy, one name kept constantly popping up, and that name was Dan Buck. Dan's the unofficial, official go-to guy when it comes to all things Butch Cassidy. He's what I'd consider an expert on the topic. He's a researcher and author. You can find articles all over the internet written by Dan, as well as a ton of articles that quote him. Dan and his wife Ann Meadows were involved with the excavation of Butch and Sundance's supposed graves down in Bolivia, and they wrote a book about their adventures down there called Digging Up Butch and Sundance. I will put a link in the episode description for the book, as well as a pamphlet he and his wife recently published titled The End of the Road, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in Bolivia. If any of you want to read any of the many articles Dan has written, check out his website, diggingupbutchandsundance.wordpress.com. Ton of good stuff on there. I really had a good time talking to him. I learned a lot. And the way they just sort of stumbled into researching the death of Butch and Sundance is very interesting. Just one piece of bad news, though. The audio quality is not too good on this one. And that's totally my fault. I'm still figuring out this whole podcasting thing, so please bear with me. I hope you'll give it a listen and ignore the shitty audio. I try to fix it up and amplify certain areas, so if you're listening with earbuds in, it's going to be kind of annoying at times, just the volume fluctuation. But like I said, it's all on me. I messed that up. Dan did exactly what he was supposed to do, showed up and gave some really good information. So ignore me, just pay attention to what all Dan has to say, because it's good stuff. So without further ado, let's get it on with this first ever interview episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast. Dan Buck, how are you?
Pretty good, hanging in there.
Thank you for joining me today. So, Dan, how did you become the guy when it came to Butch Cassidy? When I started looking up info on him and, the people that were claiming to be Butch Cassidy, your name popped up all over the place. Like, how did you get into this? What got you started on Butch and Sundance? How did you just become the expert?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the expert. I'm perhaps the most meddlesome person involved in Butch Cassidy matters. But the whole thing started accidentally, and we can all blame it on the Beagle War back in the late 70s. Ann Meadows, who is my colleague in these matters, and wrote the book Digging Up Butch and Sundance. She and I were off on a backpacking trip around South America in the late 70s, and we were in Chile, and we were planning to come back over into Argentina and got stuck on the Chilean side because they closed the border because the Beagle War was about to start.
Wow.
Never started, but the border was closed for a long time. Anyway, so we decided to come back to Argentina some years later and visit the part that we hadn't seen. And before we went down there, a friend of ours told us that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid used to ranch in northern Patagonia, and we thought, well, that'd be fun. We'll go by there and check out their cabin, and maybe we'll write an article about it or something. And that's how we sort of got sucked into the whole Butch Cassidy and South America story, and then the controversies over whether they came back or not, and one thing led to another, and we wrote an article, and we wrote some more articles, and then Ann wrote a book about our adventures researching Butch and Sundance, and here we are 20, 30 years later.
Yeah, wow. So you got the main guy that a lot of people think was Butch, that William T. Phillips character.
Right.
Did he ever actually claim it himself that he was Butch, or was it other people later on that claimed that he was Butch?
No, he at the time, back in the 20s, when he was wandering around the West, was impersonating Butch Cassidy. But then when he wrote what he thought was a screenplay, he was trying to sell it to Hollywood. He wrote a manuscript, really. It's a pretty badly written manuscript called Bandit Invincible.
Mm-hmm.
He never really, he sort of tells the story in the third person, so it's like he's writing about this person who is Butch Cassidy and so on. But when he was actually running around the West in the 20s, he was telling people that he was Butch Cassidy. And then when he died, the whole story then later took off, and other people got onto it, and one writer in particular wrote a book in search of Butch Cassidy, in which he tried to nail down the story and establish beyond a reasonable doubt that William T. Phillips was in fact Butch Cassidy. But you raise an interesting question, because usually what happens with many impersonators or hoaxers is they try and hint around that they are whomever, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, and the trick is that they want you to come to the conclusion. They hint, you come to the conclusion. And Phillips did some of that, but I'm pretty sure that he actually told people when he was wandering around in the 20s that he was Butch Cassidy, and persuaded a number of people. Many of them never really knew Butch Cassidy themselves, although later they would say they did.
Right.
I mean, every famous person has lots of friends that they actually never knew.
Of course, yep.
But, famous people tend to have more friends than we mortals. But anyway, so he did persuade people in the West, some of whom really didn't know Cassidy at all, and some of whom knew him tangentially, maybe met him once or twice.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like if somebody shows up at your house 30 years, maybe you went to high school with them and vaguely knew them, and then they show up 30 years later and say that they're this person you went to high school with. How would you know?
Right, yep.
Really.
Or even I know in a lot of these cases, the people were little children when they knew this person, Exactly. Exactly. So anyway, that's, but he worked at it, and as I say, he wrote this manuscript and tried to sell it, and then he got sick and died, and then the story took off. The thing is that it's best to go into these matters with a skeptical eye and look for what's the catch, what's wrong with this story. And with the Phillips thing, what soon came to our attention was that he was living in the United States. He was getting married in the United States when Cassidy was still alive in Bolivia. Right.
So he couldn't be physically. He could not be Butch Cassidy, no matter how many other clues you might have. They were in two different countries at the same time. And that led to an observation of mine that the calendar is the researcher's best friend.
Also, his geography was all off down there in South America as well, correct? Right.
That he didn't really, because he'd never been to South America as far as I know, and he had Butch and Sundance robbing trains that had not yet been built when they were down there. Mm-hmm. He had the ranch in the wrong part of Patagonia, and the funniest error of all was he had them camping out in this small town in northern Argentina for several weeks, and I looked up the town and I couldn't find it in any atlas, and then I finally found it. And it turned out to be a fake town that atlas companies will put a fake town on their maps so they can catch other companies plagiarizing their maps. And it's in the map trade. It's called a Mount Weasel.
Don't say. So he was looking at a map. He picked a town.
He was looking at a map, saying a library in wherever in Spokane where he lived, and he didn't know. Yeah. He just took this town name and said, "Oh, they were there." Anyway, so you really have to be a devil's advocate when you are looking at these stories of people who claim to be famous outlaws come back from the dead. Yeah. You have to look at everything and ask, well, what's the basis for this? How do we know this? And then usually the whole thing just falls apart.
Well, I mean, how up to date are you with conspiracy theories?
I'm sorry, how what?
How up to date are you with conspiracy theories? Are you aware?
Which ones?
Are you aware that there's a group of people that believe the Earth is flat?
Well, there is. In fact, they have one of the most impressive websites I've ever seen on the internet.
Yeah.
Seriously, I mean, seriously.
I've been there. Now,
you didn't know that the Earth was triangular.
Well, you know,
if you went on the Flat Earth Society website, you'd go, "Wow, wait a minute, I've had it all wrong."
They've got members all around the globe, they say.
Exactly. No, it's an impressive website and well put together. It just turns out they're serious. It's not a prank.
Well, there's
in some cases with the outlaw, the returned outlaws, there's a prank involved. It's sort of like Bigfoot. And then it gets.
That's kind of the point I was trying to make. You know, like there's another conspiracy now that people are trying to say that Australia doesn't exist. We just, you know, the powers that be just invented this continent for their nefarious purposes. But you brought up Bigfoot, right? So there's so much proof that all these theories they're not real, they're fake. And, you know, those are extreme cases. But when we talk about guys like Butch Cassidy coming back from the dead, or Billy the Kid, or Jesse James, these people really want to believe it. You mentioned looking at it with a skeptical mind, or even just an open mind. But I think when somebody really just, they want their heroes to not have died. You know, they wanted them to live to be an old age. They want Bigfoot to exist. I think these people will just overlook all the overwhelming evidence and just believe what they want to believe at the end of the day. You know?
Right. This is true. And in the big scheme of things, after all, it's not really important whether Billy the Kid was shot by Pat Garrett or somehow escaped and went on to live another 40 years. It's not a big deal one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not like whether the Earth is flat or not is rather a big deal.
Yeah, it's pretty important.
Because it would change a lot of things, especially ships sailing off the edge.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, they got an ice wall down. They say they got an ice wall so you won't fall off the edge.
Oh, okay. That's good to know. But for a lot of people, it's just not that important, and they don't. It doesn't really matter to them. And then you also get into there's another aspect, which is in some cases it's family members who get bent out of shape that their ancestor supposedly died, and they want to reclaim the story. And I think that happened with Butch Cassidy, where his family or some members of his family wanted to reclaim the story, and they had a hard time believing that he was shot by a bunch of Bolivian soldiers, and they wanted him to come home, and they wanted to take over the story. And I think that's in part what happened with Lula Parker Bettinson.
So what was going on with Butch's sister, Lula? Well,
I come to the conclusion that basically she just wanted to reclaim the story. And the situation was that, and it was a niece of one of Butch Cassidy's nieces, the daughter of another sister, told us about 20 years ago that really what happened in the family was that Cassidy went to South America. He wrote home a few times, and then he just disappeared. No more letters, and they didn't know what happened to him. And that there was a vacuum in the family, that no one knew anything, and people would write articles about it and so on, that Butch was here, there was Phillips was running around in Washington State impersonating Butch Cassidy. In fact, when William T. Phillips died in 1937, the newspapers in Washington State and then later Wyoming published articles saying that Butch Cassidy had died in Washington. Well, how would the family know how to sort through any of this, because they didn't know what happened to him? And the niece told us that no one really knew, and so there was just nothing they could do about it. They had no information. And I think what happened was Lula stepped into this, and she wanted to write a book, and she didn't really know much about her brother. She was a toddler when he left home, so she never really knew him. and she wasn't a historian or even a researcher. She just cobbled together stories she'd heard from other people. And she, even though in her book she said that William T. Phillips was not Cassidy, I think she didn't know one way or the other. And I interviewed her co-author, Dora Flack, and I asked her point blank, who was Butch Cassidy? And she said that, who was the return to Butch Cassidy? And she said that Lula never told her, but from everything that Lula said or hinted, Flack thought that William T. Phillips was the returned Butch Cassidy.
Really?
So I think the situation was that Lula didn't have a clue about what happened to Cassidy. In fact, after her book was published, and she claimed, she hinted in the book, she denied that Phillips was Cassidy, but she hinted that he was. She said that her brother died in 1937 in the upper Northwest, and he occasionally used the alias Phillips, but he wasn't
really?
William T. Phillips.
Huh.
Well, that's a bit of a tease.
Yeah, exactly.
After the book was published, though, she was wandering around other places. People told us about these stories of her. She went to Johnny, Nevada, because she'd heard that he'd been buried in Johnny, Nevada. Somebody else said that he was buried on their ranch. She just didn't know.
Do you think it's kind of the same case with Josie Bassett, Butch's old girlfriend?
Not the same case.
No, but do you think it's the same reasoning? Because she also claimed in her old age, I think there was like a 1960s interview where she claimed that Butch, back in the 1920s, he came and visited her.
You're now starting to wander into the world of old-timer stories.
Okay.
People in their old age who are telling stories, and at that point, it doesn't matter to them. It's not unlike this Irish gangster Ed Sheeran, who claimed to have done 40 to 50 mob hits for the mafia.
I just watched that movie, man. Great movie.
Including Jimmy Hoffa.
Great movie, but I don't believe him.
Right, it's a great movie, but it turns out he probably never shot anybody.
Oh, really?
And not only that, no one who studies the mob has ever heard of the phrase, "Do you paint houses?"
Right, I did read that, yep.
Anyway, but people are telling stories, and Josie Bassett, and Ann Bassett, her sister, and lots of old timers. The landscape is littered with stories, and Annie and I wrote an article once about the many deaths of Butch Cassidy. Butch Cassidy actually and the Sundance Kid. We documented about 60 different death stories on 3 continents. All of them have some source. Somebody said they died here, they died there, they died in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Mexico. Butch was stabbed to death in Paris, and then they died all over the United States. In fact, they died before they went to South America. There were stories that they were killed in Wyoming in 1898. Anyway, so that stuff just wanders around. And when you have a situation where the people actually did disappear, the stories are going to grow even faster and spread wider.
Right. And that brings me to, you wrote an article for the appendix called Bandit Resurrections, Who Was the Real Sundance?
Right.
And this is the article that, man, made me really want to be like, I got to talk to this guy. So one thing you wrote in particular, I'm going to read 2 lines from this. You wrote, "Welcome to the kaleidoscopic universe of the Wild West history, where outlaws return from the dead with vampiric regularity." And then later on you wrote, "Bandit resurrectionists eschew Occam's razor. When faced with an inconvenient fact, they roll out a deus ex machina, one after another if necessary, until all contradictions are enveloped in an elaborate web of preposterous explanations." And that's how you come up with them dying 50 or 60 times.
Right. No, people that want to believe these stories, they will ignore the most obvious things. One of the Sundance Kid impersonators, actually, there's no record he actually impersonated Sundance, but after he died, people said he said he was Sundance.
Right.
So he doesn't even get to claim it as his own story, but someone told the story. But it turns out the guy was 5'3" tall and looked like Jimmy Durante. And Sundance was nearly 6 feet tall and looked more like Robert Redford than anybody. He's a handsome guy. How in hell could this Hiram Beebe guy, how could anyone believe he was the Sundance Kid?
Right.
Well, the person who wrote the book about it speculated that he must have suffered from some bone disease that shortened his height and disfigured his face. Well, we found out he'd been in prison when he was a young man, and we got his mugshot. And sure enough, as a young man, he was 5'3" and looked like Jimmy Durante.
Yeah,
so,
and it's the same thing with that William T. Phillips, who claimed to be Butch Cassidy. They found his mugshot when he was a young man as well. And man, if you look at that mugshot compared to his pictures when he was older, it's clearly the same person. He clearly is not
right.
Butch Cassidy, you know.
Exactly. But people refuse to give up. Even after this stuff comes out, people still hang on to the original story, and what they refuse to do is follow the evidence.
Right.
Where does the evidence go? Yeah. And figure it out. Don't start with a conclusion and then jam all the evidence into your conclusion, whether it fits or not. But anyway, that happens.
What do you know about Sundance's girlfriend, Etta Place, or Ethel Place? I've seen both names pop.
Well, she remains the one mystery person in the entire Wild Bunch story because
pretty good
no one
lady.
knows for certain where she came from. We only know that she hooked up with Sundance probably in Texas in 1901, and then went to Argentina with him and Butch and lived with them down there for a few years, and then returned to the United States, we think, and then disappeared. But we don't know what her real last name was. The name she actually used, the first name was Ethel, but that's about it. The Pinkertons said that they thought she was from Texas or her family was from Texas, so there's that clue. There's been a bunch of researchers have been looking for her, tearing apart census records and city directories and so on. But because there's no last name to deal with, Place was Sundance's alias, so she was Mrs. Place. And there's nothing to go on. No one's ever found out who she really was, although a lot of people have speculated. Some people speculated that one of the Bassett sisters, I can't remember which one now, Josie or Ann, was her. But then again, the calendar intruded. She was living in the United States getting married. The Bassett sister was living in the United States getting married when Ethel Place was living in Argentina. But that story still has some circulation. People still like to believe it. It's more fun to believe that she was somebody else and she survived and so on than that she just disappeared. But anyway.
Well, that book, Digging Up Butch and Sundance, that's by Ann Meadows, and that is on Amazon if anybody's interested in buying it.
That's right.
Do y'all have any other
That's
books?
right. Still in print. And it's not a history book. It's really more like literary travel. It's the story of our adventures wandering around Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia, and then the West, and then getting involved with the PBS documentary in which we tried to find their grave and dig it up. And
oh, that's right.
That was a story in and of itself.
I didn't bring that up, but for anybody listening, you were actually involved in digging up the supposed remains of Butch and Sundance down there in Bolivia. Right.
We had an old-timer story, but it was the only story we had about where they might have been buried. And so when the PBS documentary project came calling, we said, look, this is a long shot. We have no idea if the story is true, but it's the only story there is. So if you're going to try to dig them up, this is where you're going to have to dig. Later, Clyde Snow, who was the forensic anthropologist in charge of the project, joked that no one is ever buried where they're supposed to be buried.
Nobody.
And he said he's been involved in multiple digs of people buried years ago, and it's just always impossible to find them. He went to Panama once and had 3 different stories of where this person was buried. All of them were wrong. When they went to dig up Che Guevara, the Bolivian government went to dig up Che Guevara a few years ago and to send his remains back to Cuba. Instead of doing a pick and shovel excavation, they used a backhoe.
Oh, great.
So they dug up this huge area, and they finally found him, and they knew it was him because his hands had been cut off after he was shot, so they knew they had him. But that's one of the few cases where they actually found the person, but it took an enormous amount of effort and required the services of a backhoe. Anyway, so we ended up digging up a grave of a German named Gustav Zimmer, and that's the end of that. That's the one, probably the one and only dig that will ever happen in San Vicente.
If you had to bet $1 million, would you say that Butch and Sundance are buried down there in Bolivia?
Well, I wouldn't bet, because for all I know, they're buried in Kazakhstan.
Okay, yeah, right.
But if I was forced to bet,
right? If God came down,
then I would say yes, Bolivia. Here's my 25 words or less summary. The evidence supporting the idea that Butch and Sundance died in Bolivia in 1908 is better than the evidence supporting some other scenario.
Amen to that.
That's basically it. And for years, there were 2 other scenarios. There was William T. Phillips and Lula Parker Benton's story, which in reality are the same story. But those were the only 2 that had any real support in among researchers and so on. But they've both been pretty much, the Phillips story has been completely demolished.
Yeah.
Lula's story is just impossible to prove one way or the other because she didn't present any evidence. She just told some family anecdotes. And her son, by the way, who was allegedly at the meeting when Butch supposedly came home, told a friend of ours, a fellow researcher, that the visit never happened.
Oh, okay.
So anyway,
now,
but yeah, the evidence points to Bolivia. And if I was forced to bet money, yes, I would say definitely put it on Bolivia. But it's a question of, it's just the better evidence is Bolivia.
And Meadows, that's your wife, correct?
Yes, correct.
Is she a nice lady?
She is. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, does she? I don't know if she's listening.
Yes, she is.
Maybe
now I'm going to raise my voice.
Yes,
she is.
Okay. Good.
You're damn straight. Damn straight.
Okay. Give me the name of your website.
It's one word, diggingupbutchandsundance.com.
Okay, awesome. And do y'all do the whole social media thing? Like if anybody wanted to look you up and reach out?
Our email address is on the website, but we don't have my wife's on Facebook, but I don't even know. I'm not on it. And I don't even know where her Facebook page is. She has one somewhere. I don't even know what it is. But if you go to diggingupbutchandsundance.com, our email is on there, and they can get in touch with me. I think it's my email address is on the website.
And also, for anybody listening, there's a ton of links to articles that y'all have written on your website. There's press releases. I think there's some radio spots even. Some media stuff that y'all have on there. There's a lot of information. Like if you're interested in Butch and Sundance.
We wrote an article, or it's actually a booklet called "The End of the Road: Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in Bolivia." Just came out last year, and you can buy it on Lulu.com.
Okay, there you go.
Like $9. There is that for people who have a deep, abiding interest in this subject.
I'm hoping somebody out there listening does. We'll check it out. But Dan, thank you very much, man. I really appreciate you.
Thanks, Josh.
To me.
Have a good day.
Yes, sir. You too.
Take care.
All right. Give it up for Dan the Man Buck. Like I said before, links in my description if you're interested in buying his book and pamphlet. I hope you do. Also, check out his website for all kinds of Butch Cassidy info. And Dan, if you're listening, man, I really, really appreciated you taking time out of your schedule to talk to me. It was awesome. Okay, that's about it for this episode. Next episode is going to be on a man known as Deacon Jim Miller. Miller was known by many names. Deacon, due to his association with the Methodist Church and his habits of never drinking or smoking. He was also known as Killin' Jim and Killer Miller. Both of these nicknames would be much more fitting than that of Deacon. Jim Miller was the Wild West version of a modern-day hitman. At the time of his death, he laid claim to killing 52 men, and his favorite tool for the job was a shotgun. This guy was both creepy and deadly AF. So stay tuned. Hopefully, it'll be released before the new year.